bartender, I wouldn't object to a refill, just to avoid dry throat while speaking. First of all, thank you very, very much all for coming out to encourage and honor this esteemed group of authors and to acknowledge the hard work of Proverse Press. Thank you all for coming. It is a great honor for me to win the Proverse Book Prize. I'm grateful to Verner and Gillian and the judges. I've been asked for a bit of autobiography. I was assured you were interested in my life. I hope so. And to provide a bit of background on my book. Both of my parents grew up on dairy farms in the state of Wisconsin in the United States. They escaped the hard life of the farm for jobs and a home in town. Town is a very generous word to describe the village of 400 people we lived in. It was famous for the fact that 4 bars did a thriving business due to the surrounding thirsty farmers. There was absolutely no talk of creativity or literature or poetry at any time, until I got to secondary school in the next town over, where passionate teachers in the free public schools introduced me to literature and theater, and to them I am forever grateful. To say that my parents were mystified by my interest in literature and theater would be a gross understatement. I left home at 15 and lived with various relatives and friends. A theater scholarship took me to Seattle, Washington, to the Cornish College of the Arts. And there, in addition to theater, I also began to seriously read and write poetry. By chance, I was hitchhiking, and I met the poet Sam Hamill, who you may know as one of the founders of Copper Canyon Press. And through Sam and his friendship and mentorship, I became acquainted with the artists community of Port Townsend, Washington, and the Centrum Foundation of the Arts. And in their writing workshops, I met many of the great writers of the time. Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, Denise Levertov, Galway Kinnell, Michael McClure, Margaret Atwood, others, many others. The translator Red Pine, that some of you may know. The writers of Port Townsend and those of Copper Canyon Press and Empty Bowl Books in particular became my friends and mentors. But theater was in my blood, or at the very least it was written on my bachelor's degree. So I went back to theater and the occasional acting job, directing job. I worked as a juggling comedian. I can still juggle flaming torches, as well as working as a bartender, a waiter, a taxi driver, a forklift driver, a laborer, and a construction worker in between acting jobs. I eventually founded a small theater company in Seattle that was devoted to new plays, and I ran that for 10 years. In 2004, I left Seattle and moved to Guadalajara, Mexico, to teach drama at the American School there and begin a new career as a full-time teacher. I've continued to work as a teacher, first moving to Mexico City and mainland China and finally Hong Kong. There were times over the years that I stopped writing poetry completely and focused on writing and directing plays. But I always came back to poetry. And that brings us to Hummingbird. Some of these poems, I want to hold it up the right side up. Some of these poems go back to the mid-1980s and the 90s, although the majority of these poems were written in the last 10 years. Spanish language and the sounds of daily life in Mexico were a strong influence. The long poem In Ruins is a poem about the nature of time that I've worked on off and on for many, many years, and mostly rewritten in just the last couple of years. Many of these poems, not surprisingly for someone who also writes plays, many of these poems are written in the voices of characters or about characters, sometimes multiple characters, sometimes in dialogue. The characters and voices of these poems range across time and distance, from Wisconsin farms to Mexico and Central America, from Eve to Ezra Pound, from innocent young lovers to guilty priests, and Greek myths to current conflicts. These poems vary in tone from contemplative to comic, from hopeful to heartbreaking. Poems of intellectual and philosophical questioning, love poems, poems that grieve for the dead, and poems that rage at injustice and the abuse of power. People ask me, why all these different kinds of poems in one book? There are a great variety of topics and themes: appreciation of beauty of the natural world, wonder about the nature of time, the nature of language, about political oppression, romantic and sensual love. These poems are not really arranged, they are arranged somewhat thematically. They're not arranged chronologically. The sudden shifts of tone, the different topics and themes, the seeming contradictions of very different types of poems are all deliberate choices. This book, like life itself, doesn't follow a straight line, but zigzags here and there, with unforeseen twists and turns, abrupt reversals, and inevitable returns, like the flight of a hummingbird. I'll close with a quote from the great American poet Kenneth Rexroth. As we peruse the book tables, bear in mind the quote of Rexroth, who said, "I'm sick and tired of these cheap sons of bitches who say they love literature and won't buy a book." Thank you.
Thank you very much.